Dinner Party is the 17th episode of the 6th season of Frasier. This is directed by David Lee, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. There's nothing wrong with the episode, but I find it just a little bit boring, a little bit stale. There are a couple of moments that I really enjoyed, and I will talk about those as we go through things chronologically. And I also wouldn't skip the episode if I'm binge watching season 6. I'm sure I'll always be quite happy to watch it, but it definitely isn't one of my favourites. Starts off with Frasier deciding to throw a dinner party. He asks Niles, and they spend a bit of time trying to find a date where they're both free, and they decide on the 19th, but that's Martin's poker night. So eventually Martin agrees that he'll try and change the date if all of his friends will agree. So he goes off to the room and he comes back in a little while later. Meanwhile, Ross and Daphne are getting ready to go out, and there is some bleach on the back of Daphne's dress. Ross said that she'd noticed it, but didn't say anything because it was so small, and Daphne pointed out Dr. Crane noticed it, to which Ross responds, "That's because he's always looking at your..." And then, of course, she's cut off, which I thought was funny. I did like that bit. And then the rest of the episode is basically Frasier and Niles trying to get everything organised for the dinner party, everything going wrong. It gets a little chaotic, but not chaotic enough. It's not quite a farce, but it's definitely kind of approaching that with just the constant back and forth and everything being just completely uncertain and crazy. So it could have got that far, but it didn't quite get there. And they're phoning to try and get the caterer that they want, but the caterer's booked, so they have to go with somebody else. And then they're arguing about guests, and then the guests of honour are actually busy on the 19th. And I have to say, if you're centering a dinner party around somebody or a couple, you should probably check that they're free on that night before arranging everything else. Obviously, they didn't do that, but the guests of honour are free on the 11th, so they decide to rearrange for the 11th. So they phone the caterers, and they're both phoning the caterers to cancel one and to get the other caterers for the 11th, and they drop the phones and they don't know which phone is to which caterer, and it was interesting enough. And they also need another female guest, so they decide to ask Roz if she knows somebody instead of, inviting Roz. And then Martin comes out from his bedroom. He's managed to cancel the 19th. They've rearranged it for the 11th. And of course, that's when Frasier and Niles have rearranged the dinner party for. And Frasier basically tortures Martin by suggesting they just host both events at the same time, knowing full well that would be a really horrible evening for Martin. So he goes to call his friends again, and then some of the guests call back to confirm. And before they hang up the phone, or without realising they haven't hung up the phone, they remark that Dr. Crane had invited them, and I think the husband, asked which Dr. Crane, and the response was, "Does it matter? You get the one, you get the other one." And Frasier and Niles then begin to worry that they spend so much time together, this deal, like they're never apart. And I don't think they spend a tremendous amount of time together, but as brothers, I'd say it's not a problem, even if they did spend, as long as they don't live in each other's pockets, which they don't, I don't think it's a problem. But they suddenly begin to panic that it is, and that's what the rest of the episode is about. They end up inviting Roz, which is quite nice, I guess, and Frasier asks Martin if they're odd, and Martin replies, "You're not odd, you're just special," which I thought was adorable. And Daphne ends up wearing Roz's dress. Roz ends up wearing the dress that she insisted Daphne should just put on and they can go out. And I have to say, it's very sparkly. I quite like it. And then the guests of honour call back, and they're unavailable, so they can't make it to the dinner party. And we're basically the end of the episode now. Frasier and Niles have a bit of an argument about everything, and then the doorbell goes, but there's nobody there, which I think is a reference to the Collier brothers. And then Frasier, at the very end, is taking out newspapers, which again I think is a reference to the Collier brothers, because he doesn't want anything to suggest that he's hoarding. The Collier brothers are two brothers who basically stayed locked in their own home together for a long period of time. And the suggestion there, of course, is that that's what will happen to Frasier and Niles. So it's an interesting enough concept. It plays out well enough, but I didn't think it was particularly funny, and it's just not a personal favourite. The highlights would be Ross's comment about Niles always looking at Daphne's butt, and Frasier asking Martin if they're odd, and Martin saying, "You're not odd, you're just special," which I quite liked. Eddie wasn't in this episode, unfortunately, which I think could have made it a little bit more interesting to have Eddie walking around reacting to things. And I assume maybe Eddie was meant to be in it, but he was unavailable for whatever reason. But either way, it's not a bad episode. There's nothing wrong with Dinner Party, but it's just definitely not one of my personal favourite episodes of Frasier.